So welcome to panel number 5 of Public Engagement with Science, Defining and Measuring Success. My name is Heather Douglas, and I'm in the Department of Philosophy at Michigan State University. Thank you very much for joining us across the many time zones we have represented here on the panel this evening. In my time zone, it's in the morning for Rachel in Australia, and everyone else is in between. For this evening's panel, or this morning's panel, depending on where you are, this is how we will run things. Each panelist will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes. Panelists will then have 10 to 15 minutes to discuss the issues that they raise with each other. And I have no doubt that this panel will have lots to talk about with each other. We'll then open the floor up to Q&A from the audience. Please use the Q&A function from Zoom to ask questions of the panelists. And please also follow the community standards for the event found on our website and also sent out to you through the Eventbrite registration confirmation. If you're going to tweet about this evening's talks, please use the hashtag PEWS 2020. Recordings of the talks will be posted on the YouTube channel, PEWS 2020, after the event. Also, if you have any technical issues that we can help with, please do email us at pews2020.tech@gmail.com. Be sure as well to join us immediately after the webinar on spatial chat. It's been really fun to be able to informally just talk with people and have conversations as if we were in a room together, that we could actually move around to talk with each other. It's sort of a super novel thing in the age of a pandemic. You received a link for that as well through Eventbrite. Okay, for this panel for this evening, it will be focused on public engagement work when the sample of the public engaged is carefully constructed, often by social scientists, in order to represent a broader public. Issues of representation thus come to the fore, including which aspects of the public should be represented, whether some members of the public should be excluded because, for example, they have vested interests, and how discussion among publics should be informed and facilitated. Today, we have an excellent panel with deep experience in this kind of engagement to discuss these issues with us. First, we have Rachel Ankeny, who is a professor in history and philosophy and deputy dean of research in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Adelaide, Australia. There, she convenes the Food Values Research Group and the Public Engagement in Science and Technology Adelaide Research Cluster. She's also director of the Agri-Food Policy Program within the Stretton Institute. Mike Burgess holds a research chair in biomedical ethics at the University of British Columbia, Canada. His research has focused on developing approaches to public deliberation on issues such as informed consent of vulnerable populations, animal welfare and food policy, the use of online methods to inform pandemic policies, and the release of CRISPR organisms into the wild. Kieran O'Doherty is professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Guelph in Canada, where he directs the Discourse, Science, Publics Research Group. His research focuses on the social and ethical implications and public engagement with science and technology. He has published on such topics as vaccines, human tissue biobanks, the human microbiome, salmon genomics, and genetic testing. And finally, Mahmoud Farouk is the Associate Director of the Consortium for Science, Policy, and Outcomes, and a Clinical Associate Professor in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at Arizona State University. Mahmoud is the Principal Coordinator of the Expert and Citizen Assessment of Science and Technology, or ECAST, which we've heard mentioned already several times. His current public engagement projects concern climate change resilience, gene drives, driverless cars, geoengineering, and human gene editing. You can read more about each of our panelists, including statements about how they think about success in their work, on our website. But now, let's get this panel started with Rachel.
Thanks, Heather. I want to thank Heather for the invitation. I also want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Kaurna land. The Kaurna are the traditional owners of the Adelaide Plains, and the land has never been ceded. We acknowledge elders past, present, and future. I'm sorry that I'm not there with you for professional but personal reasons as well. I'm missing coming back to Michigan. And I want to take you through, oh, and I also want to thank Heather and everyone for being online at this funny time, because otherwise I haven't been able to attend a lot because it's just been the middle of the night. So I've been trying to keep up on the YouTube feed. What I want to talk to you about today is a mixture of some research projects that I've been involved in, which in some sense represent both research, but also ways of engaging. I think they kind of cut both ways. I'm not going to talk about some of the topics that I anticipate my colleagues will. For example, deliberative processes and some of the things that I know a lot of them have also been involved in. So my talk today is about, as Heather mentioned, some of the work that we do with my food values research group at Adelaide. A lot of what we do is look at this intersection between food and science, and along the way end up doing quite a lot of public engagement in science. So notably quite a lot of work on genetics and food, but also animal welfare and the science and the values associated with animal welfare. I also wanted to highlight, as Heather mentioned, we have PESTA now, which is a research cluster around public engagement that I founded together with a scientist colleague to try to get people talking across the different disciplines. And there's a whole range of projects there, some of which intersect with some of your speakers on earlier days. This has been a great way of bringing together people with quite diverse interests in different forms of science engagement. So maybe the usual stuff, but also things like media studies and studies out of the business school. I think often we forget that part of the engagement isn't just the public, it also involves industry, it also involves other kinds of partnerships. And so the group is trying to do the broader scope. In this talk, then, what I want to do is look at the values associated with public engagement. And Heather sent me the task of talking about so-called representative samples. I want to note up front that I'm suspicious about representative samples for all sorts of reasons that will come out, and also what that might mean. But I try to take seriously highlighting what I think is good about using representative samples and some of the ways in which we've been doing it. And to come back to the question, which is the focus for this workshop conference, which is how do we know when what we're doing works? So key values in public engagement, these are, the usual, I think, that I've cobbled from numerous places, but just to highlight what we think about when we do our work, meaningful and respectful engagements with interactions that include science-related content. And here, science is very broadly construed. As I said, most of what I do involves science in some sense, although it might not at first. This idea that we want two-way communication, that part of the point, at least the part that I'm primarily interested in, has to do with when decisions have to be made and when particularly policy-related decisions are made. And so that's going to push the values related to transparency and engagement as a way to end results and not just as increasing knowledge or literacy or something like that. So in that sense, what we do focuses on some sort of deeper sense of being responsive and being participatory. I prefer the idea of people as science citizens, and that includes scientists, because scientists don't know all types of science, and so we often try to make sure in our representative groups we always have scientists who perhaps aren't from the field in question. Ideally, all of this should be ongoing. It never is in most places. Certainly, funding and other things mean we tend to do things when there's funding to do it, which means it tends to be in reaction to the issue du jour and not particularly ongoing. But ideally, if we were going to be doing this right, it would be, an ongoing commitment. So why are representative populations important? If we accept that some of our goals are about this, not just increasing literacy, as it's called, or knowledge, but having impacts on policy, even decision-making, priority setting, and so on, we need some sort of diversity in the mix. Preaching to the converted or to the science excited, if you will, is not going to be sufficient if what we're trying to do is represent society. Second, I think representative populations in some sense, and I'm hoping someone else will talk about mini publics, allows us to experiment in a sense with what are called mini publics. I won't go into any detail, but it's literally what it means. I think maybe most importantly, using conventional demographics, by which I mean representation of things like gender, socioeconomic status, education, geography, in other words, where people live, perhaps type of job, allows us to be more democratic about our public engagement, but also pushes values that I also think are critical, like anti-elitism and the value of diverse forms of lay expertise. So one of the big things when we do the kind of research we do is really emphasizing that people do contribute something even if they don't know anything, because in some sense, no one doesn't know anything. And that's one of the reasons I think I ended up doing a lot on food, was because everyone in many ways, knows about food. They can't help but eat it. So this does allow kind of a leveling effect that I think is really important when we think about representation and science engagement. The sort of proviso here is that when you use representative samples, you might want to emphasize other sorts of segments that allow you to target certain groups that you think are either going to have, and we do this, a certain interest, or either be very opposed or very pro, or have good reason because of something in particular to be interested. And so you can always layer your traditional demographics with these sorts of things, or just simply use so-called segments. Finally, this is an advantage. I guess I felt like I had to admit this, but it's easier to publish this sort of stuff. It's easier to get industry on board if you can mix this kind of representative populations with other forms of methods, right? And particularly, again, when you're trying to say to policymakers, this is something you need to consider, and you're making claims about what the public thinks, your public needs, in some sense, to be representative. And so we try to focus on all of this as it goes in this mix as part of our research. So one of the reasons why this is so important in the context in which I sit, and I don't think this is that different than other places, but I think it's important to say because people may not be fully aware, the diversity in Australia is enormous in all sorts of senses. So 66% live in 8 capital cities, but that means 34% don't. And that's actually an exaggeration. It's like 50-some% live in 4 capital cities. The climactic extremes are indeed extreme. The stat I love to use, because people don't usually realize, 30% of the population was born overseas, and these days primarily not England or anything in the British Empire. 50% either the self or one parent was born overseas. So the diversity and the sort of what people are bringing to these kinds of engagements is enormous, but yet education is still a struggle. So we rank 3rd to last, for example, among high middle income about inclusive and equitable education. So this is the background against which we're doing this research, and there's all sorts of other things that go on. So very quickly then, some ideas about methods. We use a mixture of quantitative and qualitative. I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but it lists some of the things that we use. Quantitative methods, we tend to use much more innovative techniques, and I'll talk about some of those in a minute. Qualitative are sort of some of the usual suspects like interviews and focus groups, but we've also done things like literally sit in a shopping mall and talk with people. And deliberative fora are also a way in which, particularly when we're looking for policy outcomes. Most often we use mixed methods. So why not just use surveys? This is the typical thing I find myself doing with lots of groups, probably not this one. But what we're interested in isn't how many people think something, even if we're trying to go for a representative population. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. What we're interested in is trends and correlations in who thinks what, but particularly in the narratives and the underlying values. So, why is it that they think what they think, and the story behind that. Those stories are absolutely essential when we try and get at the values that then explain what they think about science or particular parts of science much more often. So qualitative methods I've already mentioned. Again, we focus on underlying concepts. That's a very big one in science engagement, particularly because people will think very different things even about so-called technical terms, or even especially about technical terms. My favorite one at the moment is when we did some work, I'll show you in a minute, about hen welfare, that people literally had very different definitions about what counts as light. Now that might sound really obvious. Light is light, right? But they don't think all light is equal. So outdoor light, straight from the sun, even if scientifically and chemically and otherwise equivalent to artificial light inside, is better, right? And this is part of a free range kind of movement in this country and so on. You can kind of guess where this is coming from. Space is also not universally defined, right? So you have to often kind of get down to the sort of basics even of definitions and concepts, and that's why it's absolutely essential you use these long form, I was trying to be good, these long form kinds of discussions. Our key is also always open-ended and dialogue, and we allow participants to shape the discussions. We then code and use sort of usual social science methods. So I mentioned hen welfare. This is one that we did for the egg industry, which is the peak body Australian eggs that oversees all egg producers. We bookended qualitative focus groups with nationally representative survey. And this was in part because the industry partner knew that they wouldn't be able to sell the qualitative without the representative to the producers in particular. And so what we did was we had participants think through their values, and particularly trade-offs between hen welfare, producer health, and environmental sustainability. This is research, as I mentioned at the beginning, but I think it's a good example because it also becomes a form of engagement. And so, as already mentioned, light, space, fill in the blank, but all sorts of attributes about effective and objective welfare, for example, were canvassed with the participants. And a particular theme was, what do you think the industry should do or regulators should do where evidence is currently not available or is not conclusive? So a lot of talk about science isn't perfect, but meanwhile, the industry marches on. What should be done in the meantime? And it ended up being a lot of myth busting, not by us telling them how it was, but by them working through the issues around just what information is available. Most importantly, maybe all of these approaches combining quantitative, representative, qualitative, which did involve representation, but hard to say what that means when you have small groups, basically allowed all sorts of directions to emerge, as I mentioned, different concepts, for example, and for people to be clearer about what they mean and not just sort of stating, I'm for and I'm against. If we'd done this without all of that, we would have gotten, I'm in favor of free-range eggs, and that is it, and that wouldn't have been meaningful. A second project then briefly, and I need to keep talking to Mahmood and others about this one, is we're in the midst of doing a project for Meat and Livestock Australia looking at gene editing in livestock, and we've just used a very time-consuming but very productive asynchronous online discussion groups using representative sampling. So that's one of our databases on day 2. I'll highlight in a minute the kinds of things that we do with the participants. But this was of necessity because of COVID. We couldn't do our focus groups, but what it meant was there were lots of advantages. What we'll do next with this then is use so-called Q methodology, and I can talk more about this later, to try to look for shared values and views and conflicting ones, particularly with producers and experts. So looking in this different way at correlations between individual subjects and their values, and then going outward through the representative population. So in short then, in my view, the advantages and disadvantages. Advantages are more diverse groups can be engaged. Particularly in our case with the distance, a focus group is not going to capture people living in remote areas and so on. The online focus group that was representative did. So it's a combination of factors there. Most importantly, I think groups and this way of representative groups who bring different ideas to the table can expand each other's considerations via dialogue. Disadvantage, you're not getting the science engaged. You're getting people often, particularly when you're paying them incentives to participate, who aren't particularly interested in the topic that you're talking about. They may play along, and they have very different types of base knowledge. I don't think the amount is as important as the type. They're bringing all sorts of different things to the table, making dialogue perhaps a bit more difficult. Most importantly, demographics can be, or representation can be deceptive. And I had representation in scare quotes at the beginning. We may not actually be capturing the most important differences in what is important at the particular part of science or policy issue or whatever that you're engaging them with. You could get very refined, and I know Mike's done stuff other people have that are very refined, but it is a disadvantage or a potential thing that where you think you're getting something representative, it's not representative in that truer sense. So how do we know when it works? To answer Heather's final question, we do a number of things. We take baseline opinions and continue to ask, as you might have noticed on the gene editing slide, how has your opinion changed over time? A key thing is we don't look to see if people have been convinced or converted to a particular view. We don't tend to do knowledge-based questions very often. as a measure of success. We might do it just to know where they stand. Our goals are really subtle. We're trying to get people to work through complexities of issues, scientific issues that are facing our communities at the moment, and getting them to develop vocabularies and strategies, not just for thinking, but discussing with others. One of the biggest measures, and we actually ask this very openly in most of our research, is, did you go away and talk about this with someone since we last talked to you? Also, where we find them sort of saying, oh, well, I need to talk to technical experts, but I also need to go away and talk to my neighbor, or the person down the street that I know works in the water industry and therefore knows more about environment. You know, lay expertise talk is a good sign that they're starting to think more broadly about what counts as science and what counts as engagement. Finally, I was really excited in the 3-day focus group we just came off of, a participant, when we ask, and we always do, how do you think is the best way that people should be engaged with over this scientific issue, was to say this kind of forum has really expanded my interest, my engagement. I went away and looked some things up. I talked about it with someone, and that makes me really excited that in some sense it's working. And that's it, some publications and some links. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was a great start to looking at these issues and some of the really grounded applications you've done with around food. So now we get to turn to Mike Burgess.
Thank you. Let me just. Sorry, I'm getting a funny screen. I'm just trying to cancel it. There we go. Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure I get onto your slideshow there. There we go. So I'm actually going to deal with the tension that we have between diversity and representation in the context of a kind of approach to deliberative engagement that Kieran O'Doherty, who will be speaking next, and I have developed. And in doing this, I'm going to draw on our experience across different places and different topics over the last 13 or 14 years that we've been doing this. But what drove me into doing deliberative public engagement was I kept being asked, as someone in ethics, to tell policymakers what was in the public's interest. And I kept going back to the mirror and going, why am I someone who can represent the range of public interests? I mean, I'm probably the last person who should be asked this, but there's a sense that the public interest was somehow something that someone in ethics could deduce through use of principles and values, and or through talking to people. And that just became really untenable when we're talking about policy issues. And I was quite struck early in this development by Sue Sherman's comments. When approaching complex policy matters, we should actively seek out moral perspectives that help to identify and explore as many moral dimensions of the problem as possible. And so in looking at how we organize that, I then went over to Deliberative Democracy, and Rachel, here it is, many publics. So Robert Gooden and John Dreiser sort of coined this term, many publics, to characterize the times in which we come up with something that's representative. Although representative is something I think we're using in many different ways right now. But as they say, by some claim, we do not mean statistical representative, some claims of representativeness, which only one design, the deliberative poll, explicitly asserts. The diversity of social characteristics and plurality of initial points of view in the larger society are substantially present in the deliberating mini-public. Social characteristics and viewpoints may not be present in the same proportions as the larger population. So a mini-public is effectively a way of getting citizens who are diverse into a room. And when I think about that and we talk about that, I've found it really useful to think about what are we trying to draw on when we draw on public as having expertise as being members of public, which would be, of course, all of us. Well, one thing we're trying to do is engage people as citizens. That is a political role we play in trying to figure out how we live together. And we want people to bring in their diversity of life experiences and their goals. And those experiences are shaped by things vocationally, domestically, as we enter relationships, it's relational. And we are also, all of us, familiar with negotiating diverse interests, whether at work, in the university, or at the home, where we're trying to decide how much of what resource goes towards what activities. And while we draw on values and how they influence judgments, values abstractly described don't help us make decisions alone. It's when we have a conflict of values, so of course I'm interested in ethical issues in policy, where we're trying to figure out what are acceptable risks and trade-offs and uncertainty, so that I might very much value the outcome that could come from a gene-edited mosquito, but at the same time, I might also worry about the effect on the environment. And people might agree that those are both important considerations, but when it comes to particular examples, they're probably going to disagree about which one. Are they going to take a more precautionary approach or a more aggressive approach in terms of managing through gene editing? So we're also emphasizing, though, it's not just their values, and my colleagues in philosophy of science have taken me to task on this. We're also after the practical knowledge, the located knowledge that people bring, or that we bring as part of our own world. But one of the things I really want to say is we're not out to make people into mini experts. If we want expert opinion, we shouldn't go to publics to ask it. We need to get that from the experts. And sometimes when we inform people in order they can deliberate, we end up moving too much towards the mini expert model. Really what we're after as an outcome of deliberation are informed collective opinions. So for an example, we did across Canada a series of deliberations on making funding decisions for cancer drugs. One of the strong collective opinions across Canada and in a across Canada panel as well as regional panels was that cancer drug funding should support Canada-wide equity. If it's available in Newfoundland on the East Coast, it should be available across Canada for anyone else who needs it. And if it's not, it shouldn't be available to anyone. But we avoid pressure towards consensus. So there were a few cases where people did not believe national cooperation was possible. They would say equity is a great thing, but Quebec's never going to have a single system that correlates with the rest of Canada, and the West and the East will never agree to have that kind of centrist tendency. So there's a kind of political hesitancy. That didn't take away from the fact that we had a pretty strong collective opinion. But then we also want to make sure if we have more than just a bit of dissent, but we have persistent disagreements, those can be really important for us to understand it and for policymakers to understand. So there was a real disagreement in this one about whether the cost of travel from remote regions that was necessary in order to receive cancer drugs that had to be monitored at cancer centers, whether that should be part of the cost of treatment. Some people thought that that would take money away from the availability of more drugs available for cancer patients, and others thought that equalization of access was more important. So there was a real persistent disagreement on what constituted equity in those cases. I just wanted to show you briefly the process that Kieran and I use is usually, a few exceptions, a 2-week process that goes through small and large group discussions, small groups typically oriented to generating diversity, large groups oriented towards generating, that's where we do the deliberative work, and the 12-day break between is a chance to give people the opportunity to go home, to rethink, not to be making decisions and agreements out of a pressure cooker of the last hour and the 4th day in a row, and they just want to go home. A lot of the observations that happen by policymakers in these rooms leave them with things that they actually leave the room with before we ever generate reports. So there's a lot of the outcomes are emergent. So I think I've just lost there. Sorry, I'm just trying to get back to the slide. I'm just going to carry on. So one of the measures of success that I think of, and we often get asked for, is that we've seen people, as a result of deliberations, changes in governance policy and practice. And so 3 quick examples. At the Mayo Clinic, as a result of deliberations there, they formed an advisory board from 9 participants and in Minnesota, and that advisory was successful enough that it was extended also to Florida and to Arizona. And so these consider things like return of research results, incidental findings, and whole genome sequencing. In Western Australia, the deliberation considered the OECD guidelines on biorepositories, and the recommendations for change to those were embodied into the state policy in Western Australia. And just think of the BC Biolibrary as a kind of biobank. It's too complicated to explain in this context. There was dissatisfaction among the participants with how we were characterizing recruitment and consent. And the proposal was actually the participants asked that a physician always be their physician, the one who explains the biobank to them. That was impossible. Many physicians wouldn't even be able to understand explain the biobank. So a new technologist role was designed. And out of that practical knowledge that people had that they needed that kind of that kind of person explaining things, the accrual rate to the biolibrary increased and was statistically significant in that increase. But I think even given those successes, one of the things we have to ask is, are we being successful in terms of representation and diversity? And these two features are a little bit in tension if we think of representation as statistical representation. So in many cases, there was a reference to Jim Fishkin. There are times when what we want is a sample that is the same as the sample of the population. Every group that we can identify that's different is identified in the same proportion in the small group. Difficult to do in many publics, but Jim Fishkin does it by having a fairly large group. In other cases, what we're after is to maximize diversity. We want to make sure that we consider all of the options, and we want to do that because it might increase the decision-making capacity to support decision-making. And in other cases, we want enough diversity that people have to negotiate shared interests and together co-create the conclusions that they draw. And that's really the kind of focus that Kieran and I tend to take. But in work with Dan Steele, he's suggesting that the different things we want to do with deliberations suggest that we emphasize diversity or representation more or less. And so what we might be doing when we're designing representation is asking ourselves, to what extent are we improving the quality of decisions? Do we have enough diversity in our co-creation? But at the same time, as Rachel said, can we claim the legitimacy of the account of the public interest to decision makers and the public, because they too will look to whether or not there's adequate representation. So there's always a kind of tension here in terms of who the audience is, and those design features have to be woven into our deliberative design and then evaluated as in terms of whether they're being successful. And in some cases, we're trying to get marginalized people who just will not show up at deliberative fora. And in those cases, we may need to fall back onto targeted representation and supplemental groups to bring those perspectives into a deliberative engagement. And I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was fantastic. And now we're going to turn over to your off-time collaborator, Kieran.
I think you need to stop sharing the screen, Mike.
Oh, actually, I can do that.
Oh, great.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Apologies.
Okay, here we go.
That was perfectly timed, Michael, by the way. Well done.
Okay, so I also want to start by thanking Heather Douglas for the invitation and putting together this this really interesting workshop, and I've truly enjoyed this. And thank you also to Mike Burgess for lining everything up so nicely, and also for the years of collaboration. So I'm going to pick up in many ways where on themes that Mike's already introduced, but I'm going to focus on a specific issue, namely the use of psychological measures to recruit for public deliberation. And I'll give an example of where we used such a measure, but and I think in our case this was justified, but I'm actually going to end up with a critical note that I think we need to be very cautious about these sort of measures. Before I go there, though, I want to provide a little bit of context. So when Heather asked us to write a paragraph about what do we think is success about in public engagement, I had sort of the big picture in mind, and here are some of the key points that I mentioned. And then later on, I read Eric Kennedy's paragraph, and then I realized, of course, I fell into the trap of not realizing that public engagement means many different things to many different people, very obviously. And I'm focusing here specifically on public deliberation of the kind of process that Mike's been talking about. And in my thinking, there are three real markers for success. So number one, public engagement. Doing public engagement actually changes how decision makers think about the issues, and therefore changes maybe the decisions that they make. So I think this is a key marker. Secondly, good public deliberation also changes and transforms those people who take part in the engagement process. They have a broader understanding of the issues, and this comes not only from information that they're exposed to, but also from sharing the perspectives of other members of the public. And very important, just picking up on what Rachel's saying, this is not a deficit interpretation. This is not to say that it's only when you have this understanding that you can make a decision. It's through the process that you get more more social capital and capacity on these issues. Okay, and then finally, ultimately, public engagement and public deliberation should lead to better decisions through identifying key moral and practical concerns that should be taken into account in these issues, and then actually acting on those and trying to find optimal ways forward. Okay, so that's my sort of big picture understanding of public deliberation, but I'm going to now narrow down sort of to specific instantiations. So talking about public deliberation now as a very specific instantiation of public engagement and deliberative democracy, I've identified, based on definitions by people like Simone Chambers and John Gastel, 7 elements that I think have to be present to be able to justifiably say, yes, you've engaged in public deliberation. And the first one of those is that participants are selected to reflect the diversity of the groups affected by the issues discussed or considered to be representative of those groups according to other criteria. Then there's a lot of other stuff. Participants need to be provided with information. They need to engage with each other respectfully, and a few other things. All of these seven things are necessary, but the first one is the one I'm going to be focusing on. That one. Okay, and I'm going to be talking about a particular process that we did on the topic of childhood vaccination. And this followed the process that Mike outlined roughly. I'm going to do another flow chart just to illustrate this. We had 25 participants go through the entire process of 4 days, 5 different deliberative sessions focusing on different questions, and ultimately resulting in 20 policy recommendations that were self-generated by the group. I'm not going to go into the details of the content of that deliberation, but just to know what we're talking about here were the kind of questions that participants deliberated about. So first, how should vaccine policy respect parents' responsibilities to their children while reducing risk to other people? 2, should certain childhood vaccinations be required in Ontario? 3, should information about vaccination and vaccination policy be communicated? 4, what are appropriate responses when an adverse event related to a vaccination is reported? The only thing I really want to emphasize here is that these kind of questions remain, that there are certain ethical trade-offs in these questions that are somewhat independent of the pro versus anti-vax kind of dichotomy. These are the kind of questions that policymakers have to answer in spite of differences in agreement in the population. And even among strong public health advocates, there are differences in how these values are traded off. So the reason I say that is that you can't sort of get away with saying, oh, well, you know, anti-vaxxers are crazy. It doesn't matter if you think that, or if you do or don't think that. The point is these ethical questions remain. Okay, so here the flow chart again, not as pretty as Mike's. Again, there's a lot of stuff going on here, and I'm focusing only on that first box here of recruitment. And so the point is to do all of this good stuff, to get public input, to get transformation of decision makers, publics, and so on and so on. You've got to have a group of people in the room. And how do you get to that particular group of people? So we were looking for 25 demographically stratified participants. The process we used was we sent out 5,000 letters across the province to random households, and we focused on kind of a good balance across different geographical areas, rural, urban, and so on. We were expecting between 150 to 250 responses. We only got 84. And that's important for reasons I'll explain in a moment. The reasons why are not entirely clear, but we think we had a bad list that we paid good money for. Out of those 84 then, we had these 84 people expressed their interest and provided us with demographic information. And we then selected from those 84 to kind of maximize diversity of that final group. So this is not that important, but these are just an example of the demographics we were looking at. So gender, age, marital status. We included parenthood status because we thought that was relevant to the issues. And then we also, we say ethnicity. There's lots of different debates about this in social sciences. Race, ethnicity, how do they relate to each other? So we used the label ethnicity and we left it for self-declaration. So we didn't have pre-given categories. And so the categories that you see here are not predetermined by us. They were the categories chosen by the participants. So now, so far, we've done nothing unusual in the recruitment. But now what I'm going to introduce is the notion of vaccine hesitancy. And so even though the issues that we're discussing in the deliberative forum remain independent of the kind of pro versus anti-vaccine dichotomy, the fact is that people most people fall somewhere on the spectrum of attitudes with respect to vaccine attitudes. And so how do you justify legitimacy of a process if, for example, all the people in the room happen to be strong pro-vaccine advocates? Or vice versa. If, as we always know, if we, with a town hall meeting, say, for example, the squeakiest wheel is the one that turns up. If we have a room full of very strongly opposed to vaccination attitudes, how do we demonstrate legitimacy? So vaccine hesitancy is defined by McDonald and Co. as delay in acceptance or refusal of vaccination despite availability of vaccination services. Moreover, vaccine hesitancy is complex and context-specific, varying across time, place, and vaccines. It is influenced by factors such as complacency, convenience, and confidence. There's so much written about this, I can't even sort of begin to go into that. But the estimates are in Canada that approximately 70% of people are fairly pro-vaccination. Only 2 to 3% are strongly against vaccination, and then the rest is sort of somewhere in the middle. So if we've only got 25 people in the room, and if we do a sort of random kind of selection with demographic stratification according to the usual demographics, it's quite unlikely that we won't have any people strongly opposed to vaccination in the room. And so that seems to be problematic if we're having a conversation and deliberation on this topic. So what we did is we used a vaccine hesitancy scale, the parent attitudes about childhood vaccine survey. We adapted it slightly so that the wording made sense in the context of our group. And when we sent out those 5,000 invitation letters where we got people to express their interest and we got their demographic information, we also administered a vaccine hesitancy survey. With the idea that we would use this together with the demographics to get to ensure diversity in the sample, in the forum. Okay, so here's what we ended up with. So the first plot here is what we got in the pool of 84 people. So these are the 84 people who responded to the invitation and said, yes, I'm interested, I'd like to be a part of this. Here's my name, here's all my demographic information, and I've completed this vaccine hesitancy scale. And you'll see that we have about 60% low on vaccine hesitancy. So from sort of population surveys, we estimate that the population kind of percentage would be around 70%. And then high in the population survey suggests that we only have about 2 to 3% on that. So we have a lot extra here. So what we try to do, we want to end up with 25 people in the room, but we know that people drop out for all sorts of reasons. So we typically overrepresent to about 32. And in that 32, we chose, I think we selected about 4 people that were on the high end. And we wanted, and the rest we wanted to get kind of evenly distributed. But here's what we ended up with. We ended up with only 2 people finishing I'm not sure if that's 2 or 3. 2 or 3 people ending the full process who were high on the vaccine hesitancy scale. Over 20 on the low and nobody at all in the medium. Now you can see here the medium was very slow, very low anyway, but we ended up with none at all. So what was going on there? The main problem is that as anyone who's worked in recruitment knows, you can only really realistically take a small number of demographic factors into account to balance out for diversity. As soon as you get 4, 5, or 6, it starts to become almost impossible to do justice to all of them. And we actually had a very specific trade-off that we faced, namely that if we wanted to increase the diversity on the vaccine hesitancy scale data, we would have decreased diversity on the race ethnicity side. Now, we already had a very white, very middle class, very European kind of sample as it is. So to reduce the diversity on that even further was not something that we wanted to do. Now I see my time is running out, so let me skip to the take-home message. I believe that it is, in our case, it was justified. In fact, it was important that we use this kind of psychological measure. Because what we've always tried to do in kind of representing diversity in our samples is diversity in terms of life experiences, commitments, backgrounds, vested interests, discursive styles, and so on. And we've always used demographics as a kind of proxy for those. So this was the first time that we used a a psychological measure, and I think it was justified. However, what I'm concerned about is that there's a temptation to become ever more sophisticated on psychological measures. And I know at least one project where there was the use of discrete choice experiments to characterize people in the recruitment. And it concerns me because this reduces transparency of the recruitment process. It puts emphasis on expert-driven development of scales and measures, and it lacks it's difficult to compare those to the criteria for diversity that are largely politically recognized. And I believe this is counter the principles of deliberative democracy. And here's an up-to-date first day of school picture.
Hooray! Fantastic. And for our final speaker, we have Mahmoud for, please.
All right, so let me share my screen. Just a minute. Okay. All right, I have to go. Okay, sorry, I have to, apologies. Always works during trial, but okay. Let's see. All right. So it's always a challenge. First, thank you, Heather, for putting together a wonderful conference. You know, I've attended all of them, all the sessions, and really enjoying and learning so much. So this has been fabulous. So, you know, it's always a challenge to be the last speaker on the 5th panel on a week-long conversation. Most things that you want to say have already been said. So I'm going to do something a little bit different and talk about, not about me or a specific project, but talk about what a group of us have been trying to build over the last decade. This group includes someone you already heard from on the first day, Darlene Cavalier, and other STS, STP, or PES community, the others that STS, PES, and the STP communities knows very well, like Dix Clove, Dave Guston, Dan Sarowitz, Larry Bell, David Sittenfeld, Rick Worthington, David Tallman, Jason Delborn, Gretchen Gainell. So when I say we, I mean a combination of some of my partners in crime. So our story starts where another story ended. You know, there was the Office of Technology Assessment in US Congress. It was a crowning achievement in 1972 when the study of societal implications of science and technology found an institutional home. As some of you know, that office was defunded in 1995 as a sacrificial gesture from then House Speaker Newt Gingrich. So two things have followed. A constant effort in the US in every election cycle, whenever you have the Democrats taking over Congress or the Senate, an effort to bring back OTA. And the other part is that in Europe, where they had emulated OTA, they have been actually incorporating a lot of public participation process, PTA process, in their technology assessment. So recently, after many tries, the major breakthrough came in 2008 when, the Congress set up a small TA unit within the Government Accountability Office. And in last year, after the disastrous Facebook hearing, there was some kind of a window opening, and now GAO's capacity has been extended to a new office called SDAA. Now, our position on all this revival effort has always been that, doing just TA is not enough. This follows from the thinking around what post-normal science, or PNS, which calls for broader societal peer review of problems characterized by high uncertainty, decision stake, and disputed values, from nuclear waste to GMOs to geoengineering to gene editing to global pandemic. So what we envisioned is a complementary process, a participatory technology assessment process that complements and fills in what we see as a democratic gap. So our effort, the group's effort, has been to try to build this capacity in the US. And specifically, what we decided in 2010, that instead of waiting for all the political stars to align, why don't we imagine a distributed institutional structure that we called Expert and Citizen Assessment of Science and Technology, or ECAST, which will combine academic research, informal science education, and nonpartisan policy analysis to engage lay publics on S&T policy issues. Specifically, it will add public participation with expert assessment. It will integrate diverse values and perspective. It will constantly learn and innovate, and it will be integrated in policymaking and broader societal dialogues. So after a demonstration project providing citizen input on the UN Convention on Biological Diversity in collaboration with the Danish Board of Technology, ECAST piloted its first independent PTA project with NASA on its asteroid initiative. So this paved the way for PTA project with Department of Energy on nuclear waste, with NOAA on community resilience. ECAST portfolio now includes projects on climate intervention research, automated vehicle futures, gene editing, and supported by more than $3 million in public and philanthropic funding over the past 5 years. So the basic ECAST process, we do all the things actually Mike and Kieran says in terms of participant recruitment and all of that. I'm not going to get into that, but I'm just going to tell you what our basic process is. So it basically includes, before we start, we have two assumptions, two propositions. One, that lay publics have valuable knowledge and perspective, and incorporating them leads to better societal outcomes. This is a point that Kieran made in one of his 3 points. So we also have 4 design principles. We said it needs to have diverse representation. Again, our emphasis on diversity, then representation. Deliberative multidirectional learning, informed community participants, and clear, comparable, and usable outputs. So the current ECAST PTA method has 3 participatory activity. The first one is a problem framing activity. Second one is a public deliberation activity. And the third one is a results integration activity. The problem framing activity is an expert stakeholder deliberation about who to engage, what questions to ask, what information to provide, what data to collect, etc. The deliberation activity is usually a day-long engagement of about 100 representatively diverse citizens sitting at tables of 6 to 7 with a facilitator and going through several rounds of discussions and voting. The third activity is also an expert stakeholder deliberation, this time about the outputs and how to integrate them in policy and actions. So important to note that we see this not as one-off, but iterative, innovative, and integrated process. So ECAST distributed network model, being outside of government, has allowed us to be pragmatic, agile, flexible, and adaptable, and opportunistic. This has been a blessing considering the science policy ecosystem we're positioning ourselves in, an ecosystem built on the linear model of innovation, where society and public generally comes at the end of the process. It's, to bring in public in the upfront decision making, it's really hard in an institutional setting. So although there's been some tinkering about this model and institutions, but this has always been at the margin. And so with that context, when we enter the question that Heather posed about success, it means from an institutional and point of view means more than one thing. So first thing that I said is the whole idea of socialization. So immediately after our launch, and especially after our first successful demonstration project on biodiversity, which I mentioned, Darlene Cavalier, Rick Worthington, and I have knocked on many congressional agency office doors without any explicit buy-in or commitment. Good idea, but I don't know how it fits with what I do. That was the standard answer. So it was much welcome now if you look at what the National Academy has been saying in the last 5 years. So especially this statement that public engagement cannot be an afterthought when it comes to gene drives is really for us who have been trying to work with the Academy a path-breaking moment. Because in 2012, when we did the worldwide views on biodiversity in a museum of the National Academy, they refused to even lend us co-sponsorship because they were afraid they will legitimize that activity. So now imagine the role reversal now that last year they invited us to present in the solar geoengineering panel the outcome of our public deliberation. So we think this is not to be taken lightly. Now you see similar thing now, within industry and also in philanthropy, they're joining the choir in terms of calling for public engagement. Now, as I mentioned, one of the criteria that we pride ourselves in is to be able to innovate. We know that because of budget constraints and specific contexts, we can't always do all that we want to do. So we've been very opportunistic and going from one to the other. We've always tried to see what is that we learned from the last exercise that we can improve on the next one. So what happened even when we did the worldwide views on biodiversity, we started with doing a national session that we designed ourselves involving US experts and stakeholders. So when we got the NASA project, here we actually introduced expert engagement and also what Rachel said about getting qualitative narratives, not only just the what, but why you think what you think. And also because we partner with museums, we were able to make our engagement very interactive. So we use game boards, we use a lot of interactive props to engage people beyond just giving their statements and going around the table. So moving on to that, when we got to climate resilience project that was funded by NOAA, this gave us an opportunity to do this at scale. So we were able to train museums in 8 different cities to do deliberation on climate change resilience. Now, as we are building, one of the questions that came up, and we're settling on our kind of 3-step model that I told you about, we came on the question, what if in our framing, we miss questions? So for instance, that people want to answer that experts don't consider as important. So what we have started to do is that we have started to do open frame dialogues now, where we do concern and hopes gathering exercise where the public is able to bring in their hopes and concerns, and we use that even before expert engagement to frame the issues. Now, similarly, the other thing we have added, and this goes to Rachel's comment about working with industry, now we are to have more uptake about of the deliberation outcome. We have started to form a coalition of actors even before we begin deliberation, so that we are kind of addressing their concerns and then giving them public value input. So the third success criteria is obviously the usual outcome measures. We did it impact any decisions? There's obviously the scholars part, so we are advancing knowledge. But we also asked, for instance, NASA what they found useful. And these are the many list of things. But what was the most remarkable outcome out of that project was something that we are not even deliberating on, and which was the idea of planetary defense. Apparently the publics were very concerned that there was no such office, and NASA took that input and created the Office of Planetary Defense. And as you see that Lindy Johnson, who appears on the right-hand corner, is the Planetary Defense Officer for NASA, who, by the way, has become our biggest champion. So here now is another thing that happened, which is what Kieran talked about. It transforms the decision maker. Lindy was one of the skeptics, and he was not the only one. But after the process, he has now become our greatest champion. So this prompted us to think, okay, what kind of impact it has on the expert culture? And my colleague Jen Schneider and David Tomlin, you heard from Jen, and Jen mentioned this, they have an NSF study where they're going back to our projects in NASA, Department of Energy and NOAA to see what kind of impact it had on, on them as well. So since we are becoming sort of moderately successful, in terms of socializing, now we have a capacity problem. So even though we get a project, we are building through museums, but the whole idea of, doing engagement is not only just designing a program, but also linking it to decision making. So in collaboration with the Association for Science and Technology Centers, we have sort of started a fellowship program where we're teaming up a person from a museum and a person from either an NGO or a local government or an academic who are working together to co-create a public forum on issues of community interest. And they just had one on water in Waco, Texas last night that one of the teams have developed. So last but not least, the question becomes, okay, we need a community of practice and we also need to grow the network. Because one of the things is that the area that we are traversing combines many different disciplines, from deliberative democracy to science and technology studies to public engagement science, science communication, and so forth. So growing the practice and scholarship is for us to take all of that on is a bit of a challenge. So we are doing it by partnering with other networks, organizations, and growing a community of practice. Now, if I have just 1 minute, I would like to just end by reminding ourselves that ultimately we're talking about people, although we're using a lot of charts and so forth. This is just a 60-second of our climate geoengineering meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahmood. That was so lovely to actually see actual people doing this at the end. So I want to just ask first if you have questions or comments for each other before turning things over to the audience.
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, so my question is to all of you, particularly prodded by seeing Mahmood's people. What are you doing now? So I mentioned we've done an asynchronous sort of online group, which I think had certain advantages. But how are you evolving your projects to deal with not being able to have people in a room together? Anyone? Because we're struggling with different projects and different ways of doing it, and like I said, advantages and disadvantages.
So we have, like I mentioned, 5 teams that are trying to design who were supposed to do a public-facing forum. 5 of them have come up with 5 different approaches. And one of the pushback I got was synchronous versus asynchronous, because we argued that, you know, to have deliberation, you cannot do it in asynchronous mode, and they're trying to prove us wrong, because they said that, so one of them is actually in Salinas, they're working on food issues. And with youth, and they said they have designed these beautiful kits that they're sending them, and they're creating a process where they will come back and continue the conversation, but asynchronous mode. So I'm seeing, you know, still the ideal is to face-to-face, but we're seeing that people are innovating in a lot of different ways. The way people use Zoom and breakout rooms, and then they have a asynchronous online version that others can participate. So those kind of things.
Karen or Mike, do you have any approaches for the pandemic space?
We have recruited people into, we're actually at the point where the struggle is that we need policymakers who are willing to actually have public input, and the expert cult of public health makes it really difficult for them to start to listen to the idea that we should have public input. We have tried a limited Zoom deliberation with, it was really just to see how the deliberation will work. I think I was so incredibly skeptical that I was surprised that it went relatively well, but the depth of discussion that we get in 2 weekends of 7 to 8 hour days, I just am very surprised that if anyone thinks we can get that online. Jim Fishkin, I know, has announced that he's taken deliberative polling online and he doesn't see any problems with it. But of course, Jim's outcomes are pre-post measures on policy options that he's already got formed. So it's a little easier to see how that might work there. And that might be the alternative, is if as we go online, we might have to be a little less emphasis on co-creation, and there's some places that might be appropriate. We've also got ongoing deliberations, just like Mahmoud was suggesting. We've had to go back to the drawing board. In some cases, we're stalling. In other cases, people are going online, and in some cases, we're suggesting that maybe deliberation isn't going to be able to be done in these cases, and it's more important to go for wide diversity and have focus groups and figure out what we do with that. Or can you blend that into something that's deliberative later? So I think it's taking a lot of creativity. My worry is that we might jump on this bandwagon, like we often do, without sufficient rigor and looking at what we're doing and being careful about it.
Yeah, and maybe we won't have to do this very long, and then we can go back to actually being in person.
Well, but I'm not convinced, Heather, because I mean, what we're seeing, like I said, is that we have lots of people engaged and involved that we would never, ever, ever, ever be able to access because of different times of day.
Yeah.
Because of, woman with baby in her hand sitting there and doing, and it's something to do, and the remote. I mean, the geography. So, I mean, Mike's faced this before and dealt with it in different ways. But if you're truly trying to get people in and not just be in the cities, it's not possible. I mean, we're not going to ever be in a situation to be able to fly in people, for a focus group or a deliberative event.
Yeah.
So I guess I think it's broken down some boundaries. I mean, I'm like Mike, I was sure it wouldn't work, right? But there were definite advantages of voices getting heard that get out of the loop, and at this political moment, at least here, I would think the states might be, people are feeling out of the loop, right?
Right.
So it's a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always trade-offs, right? So clearly, if you have online components, you have much greater reach, and you have a whole bunch of other advantages. So for sure, there's also huge economical advantages for doing it online, right? So huge advantages, no doubt about it. But I think, when it's we've always had conversations with collaborators who were doing online engagement processes, and who were always telling us, oh, this stuff that you do expensive and lots of we can do that really easily with an online tool, and yeah, you can do something, but what exactly are you doing? and my concern is also that you know, we live in a Twitter world of factoids, and I see deliberation as a kind of a slow thinking, slow decision making kind of counterpoint, and you know, we're the underdog, I think, in that, right? I think holding on to even the fact is, like, you know, even when you know, over the years, like when people want to collaborate and say, oh, you know, I want to do something, but can we do what you do, but instead of doing it over 4 days, can we do it in half a day, right? You know, so there's always push to do it shorter, to do it more efficiently, to do it, you know. So I think who knows what's going to happen, you know, with COVID moving forward. I think, unfortunately, I don't think we'll ever get back to sort of pre-levels. I think we've had a permanent change. So even if we don't have to physically distance anymore, now, you know, at university teaching, it's going to change forever. Public engagement is going to change forever, because the proof of concept is going to be like, well, you've done it. You've done it online. Why not, you know, what's the problem? So, and I am very concerned about it. Like, so in spite of all the benefits that you mentioned, I am concerned that we're sort of shifting more into do it fast, do it efficient, do it online.
And then it might get thinner.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you all the extent to which you see in your practices a shifting of the understanding of what science is among either the scientists or members of the public, or both. Because that seems to be a bit of a theme, by emphasizing uncertainty and the boundaries and limits of what is known, or perhaps expert disagreement, that people's views of what science is has shifted. Is that part of what is happening as well?
I'm happy to go first. I mean, it's part of what we actively push. I was very clear about that, right? That we're as interested or more interested in people looking at the process of science than the facts and the matter of it and the, you know, expertise. So, you know, I'm seeing it probably because we actually encourage it pretty strongly. But what we're also seeing is a very bimodal response, because at the moment, people want science to be right and true because we need it, you know? And so I think it's an interesting moment where I think we've made a lot of progress towards thinking about science and process, and understanding that 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, you know, all the sorts of things that philosophers of science and others would really value, sociologists of science in particular. But that's really hard in the current climate, because that's not very comforting. You know, I think people are more aware, particularly of the complexities of public health, than they were even a few months ago. But again, that's not necessarily what people are looking for. Now, here in Australia, we're not having a huge loss of faith in science or any of this stuff. We're not having us-them stuff. There's a very small minority of, you know, mask refusers or whatever else. It's been an incredibly compliant kind of population. A lot of people think that's really problematic, right? Because there hasn't been enough engagement with the detail to warrant the compliance. So there's different levels, and particularly some of the racist and other assumptions that were loaded into the early public health advice. So yeah, long answer, but I think there's lots of issues at the moment.
Anyone else on this issue?
I guess I'd just say that we emphasize with scientific experts that they need to identify uncertainty in places where they don't have answers, and that's actually gives a larger role for publics rather than less of a role, and that by doing that they create space for deliberation, and they're more likely to get something useful from the deliberation. And in that sense, I think we create the sense that science is something that publics can have a dialogue with rather than something that they take. At the same time, there are moments when people will say, that's an expert decision, and we're okay with experts making that decision, but we want representation. We don't want just an expert. We want a range of experts, and we want an ethicist, or we want a lawyer, we wanted this or that in there. So there is a sense that knowledge is negotiated when it comes down to policy applications, at least.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, I mean, the word science, of course, is used in different ways by different people at all times. But I think in true sort of Wittgensteinian way, we all use the word science in different ways at different times, depending on what the language game is. at the moment. I think it's been interesting to see what's happening in the UK with very strong rhetoric around, the government is science informed, and then there's been a lot of criticism that, well, who exactly are these scientists, and what exactly do you mean by, science informed? So it's it has a lot of kudos, a lot of cred to kind of use science as a kind of rhetorical backing until you mess it up. What I also find interesting on a lot of Twitter conversations is scientific arguments by a variety of people. So because the Twitter forum, it's more of a flat forum. So it's not like like a journal article where you have to have certain kind of markers of membership to get in. So you, for example, you get a guy who's saying early on in the lockdown, I should, out of all the people, I should understand this because I'm a researcher who traces pandemics mathematically, blah, 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 blah. However, I don't know what's going to happen. Here's what I'm thinking. And then you get a guy who's, an engineering expert, so knows numbers, knows stuff, has no idea about pandemics and biology, and challenges, that account. So you get some really interesting stuff. But I guess I don't think that's kind of different from what we've always had. Like, I think it's the same things, maybe augmented a little bit more.
Okay, so at this point in time, unless my mood wants to jump in and talk about this question, but he might be like, no, that's okay.
I just think there are a lot more people asking for civic science about public engagement than before. The philanthropies are supporting more work in this area. There's a recognition of that science failing to meet societal needs. So there's an opportunity, but there is not specific, like, okay, how do we take that idea and do something with it? So that's where a lot of work still needs to be done, I think.
Yeah. So now I want to invite Megan to provide questions from the audience. And if you have questions for our panel, please put them in the Q&A function for Zoom.
Okay, great. We have one question now from Jen Schneider, who says, this has been a great panel. I wonder if the panelists could discuss further influence on decision makers' decision-making as a marker of success. This kind of linear relationship between a public engagement project and decision-making is often hard to substantiate directly. How to measure?
So I'm happy to start. So we're under a very strict, no one's from the UK here, not unlike in the UK, we're in Australia under a really strict, we report on so-called impact. And this is one of the things that we have to do much more generally. And it's never linear, to sort of already problematize part of your question. We do the best that we can to try to get our decision makers and policy makers to always come back to us, but you have to embed in everything, checking back and staying in contact with those people over the 10 to 15 year run. I mean, we really are talking for most kinds of questions, you'll have a little blip, but the data shows that sort of the impact is a much longer sort of standing thing. We do the simple things like literally putting trackers on policy decisions and whatever else that we know are happening, automated ones. But it's that informal staying in the networks and in contact with people who are making decisions, particularly those who are directly involved in your, whatever it is, deliberation, received your white paper, the discussion, and so on. But as your question implies, it's almost impossible. So I think the other part of the answer is it's never linear in the sense that part of what these things do when they work is that they get certain outcomes, but also just the whole complications of the matter in the air, and they get out there and they're being discussed. And that's where we really push back, sort of in my day job as a deputy in research, that it's pretty hard to measure impact when the biggest impact you can have is if everybody's talking about it, at which point the linearity and the traceability becomes negligible. I don't know if that gets at what Jen wanted, but yeah.
If I can, there are places where policies use the wording from public engagements, and you still can't say that it came from public engagement, because the wording has become something that was picked up and used. And I think a lot of policymakers will be very hesitant to say that they listen to one source and this is the source for the policy. And so it's very difficult. At the same time that something gets used, that it gets trafficked, that it gets utilized and discussed. And I think most of us would hold that public deliberation shouldn't be determinative of policy, but an input along with other things. And so as long as we can demonstrate that it becomes part of that policy conversation, I think that's probably as close as we can get most of the time. And certainly I think Rachel is absolutely right. A lot of the time it's the informal networks that allow you to begin to identify that it's being taken up in the conversation, and then how you formalize that is tricky. But at the same time, that then can lead to subsequent, like Mahmoud's talking about, this sort of cascading effect of being requested to do something after being successful in something else. That, I think that's where we're seeing success, is that this public engagement is being picked up the way, except that it is.
Yeah, I want to echo the how difficult it is to get this. I remember there was one project where we had a funder, almost harass us, I'd say, to demonstrate where was the impact from this. And ironically, it was one of the areas where we actually really had a very sort of kind of linear impact, where we had a science partner who wanted to build sort of institutional policy based on the outcomes of the deliberation, and he actually did that. He actually took specific points from the deliberation and built sort of institutional policy around. And in fact, it had then went on into like a training program, so it had even further reach that way. So we were, but when we tried to say it, like say, well, this is what happened. It's like, okay, but where's the evidence, right? Like it was impossible to kind of pin down to the satisfaction of the funder. And I guess the thing is, like, if you looked at this in sort of through a formal lens, I mean, ideal would be something like that. If you had say a report, like or like these are the conclusions or recommendations, we as a public panel come up with, and in a very formal way that went to a decision-making body, like a law or a regulation-making body, and they formally had to account for how they acted on this or not. So if you had something like that, it would be very clear. And I think for all of us, it's very tempting to want to see that, because we want to have, well, evidence, right? We want to know that this had an impact or not. But I think, back to, well, how have I changed as a result of being part of engagement processes? And and it's even I know I've changed, and I can point to some specific things, and I was like, oh, well, that really, I remember that one guy said this thing, and then everybody commented on that, like, wow, that really changed my thinking. But the fact is, I've probably changed so much more than just that one thing. How much have I changed from attending a conference and seeing 10 outstanding presenters, right? So, and how have all of my decisions changed as a result of that change in me, right? So I think we will always be able to measure some things if we try hard enough, and we have to continue doing that because there's the pressure to do that. But I think the truly profound changes will not be measurable.
Unless people send you thank you notes.
Yes.
So, in the previous panel, we talked about the temporal, second, third order effect. So it's very hard. It doesn't happen at the time scale you're actually doing your measurement. So we have hard enough problem as it is to turn the people as subjects by studying them. Now, if we have to study the decision maker in kind of similar rigorous way, I don't know, at some point we lose sight of why we are doing it. But at the same time, I think there is, the agency, whenever they fund us, they collect a bunch of information. And the things that they collect we don't really value them. Like, was this picked up in the newspaper, or did so-and-so, those things are completely meaningless, yet that's what they measure as the justify their funding. So I think we can definitely do better, but I don't know whether we can actually capture it in the time frame of interest.
This is actually a nice segue into Bruce Lewinstein says, great discussion about what we mean by representative. I'm curious about one of the outcomes Mahmoud listed. NASA liked knowing emerging areas of agreement because the knowledge could be useful for framing future messaging? That sounds a lot more like marketing, research, deficit model thinking. How do we link that with more democratic engagement?
It is. I agree, because what happened is that we didn't know what will come out of that. And this was a very prescribed project, and we had very limited degrees of freedom. But what happened was that NASA obviously was trying to argue it in terms of scientific, technical, or economic returns. But they found that this whole idea of planetary defense was where it was actually addressing a public value. So I don't know whether that makes that exercise any less useful than, you know, a truly democratic way, because we didn't have an option of saying no. I mean, that's why we are now working on more creating this coalition where we have independence, and we can actually have, you know, the option of asking the public, should we or should we not question, not the how question. So I think it's a matter of where we situate the deliberation and who controls the funding and who writes the report, and how transparent that process is. That could be some ways of making it more democratic.
Can I weigh in on that one? So we do quite a lot of work for industry, and obviously what they're interested in is, in some sense, marketing. I mean, that's just the nature of the beast, right? But the way I think about it is that a lot of what they need to do is figure out how to align what they're doing with what people want, particularly when we're talking about emerging technologies in science. And so I don't think it's a bad thing, I guess, Bruce, that this feeds into something that's going to be marketing, but it doesn't need to be deficit model driven, right? So part of it is that when people say they don't want something, a new technology, a new approach, a certain kind of process, whatever it is, that's not just because they don't know it. And so part of what we really do in our work with industry is push back against, and not all of them think that, by the way. They know this is more complex, and particularly the people who are marketing, because they know the simple message often doesn't get them very far. So we try to engage with people and not package our stuff up with a nice, neat bow, in part to encourage them to think about the complexities and to take the community view very seriously. You know, I think in some corners, if people aren't going to buy the technology, they're just written off because they're the people we don't care about. They're not our market. But the point is, you know, with any of this stuff, the effects are so wide-ranging that the community matters, not just whoever might be the anticipated consumer. So I think there's a lot of ways in which you can kind of play into their desire to get marketing results, but twist it to the kind of purposes that we are promoting.
Thank you for wonderful talks this evening, and we will continue the discussion tomorrow at 1 o'clock with our cross-boundary panel. Thanks so much.